because what they're trying to do at the moment is draw Russian forces in so that they can basically engage in a war of attrition, attacking their artillery pieces, their tanks, their forward units, their ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, or whatever. Obviously, the Russians are trying to do something similar to Ukraine. So it's a very attritional phase, and the assumption is that if they can get through this successfully, later on, they'll be able to push much harder through rather depleted Russian lines, and then the sort of breakthrough that one associates with big offensives, with more maneuver and as mobile units press through. So it's a very hard, tough stage at the moment, which is one reason why these munitions are wanted.
Now, first today, it's thought the US is to send controversial cluster bombs to help Ukraine as part of a new multi-million-pound military aid package set to be announced today. Production of the munitions is banned in 120 countries, including the UK, due to the harm that they cause civilians. But will any of this alter the course of the war? Well, joining me now is Lawrence Freedman, Professor Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College. Good afternoon, Sir Lawrence.
Good afternoon.
Just talk to me first about this announcement from the US that we're expecting. Is this likely to be a game changer in your view, or did all of this weaponry that's now being pledged need to arrive before the counteroffensive started?
Well, the Ukrainians will tell you it's a shame a lot of it has taken so long. I think with the question of cluster munitions, it's something they've wanted for some time, partly because they just don't have enough artillery anyway, and this is another form of artillery. Secondly, it's a particularly effective form, nasty form, because little bomblets drop over a large area, so that if you want to take out a trench, for example, or there's a Russian position that is causing you a lot of trouble, it's something that can be quite effective. So it's most important because Ukraine just needs almost any artillery at the moment, but it's an effective form, despite, as your news story said, its undoubted controversy.
Should that have actually meant that, is it wrong for the US to send these munitions, given that 120 countries have banned them and they are, deadly for civilians?
Well, as you recall, people thought that people believe that mine should be banned, but one of the reasons the Ukrainian offensive is held up is because of extensive minefields. It's partly, obviously, if you use these things against civilians, it would be quite horrific, but that's true. Again, as we've seen, if there's all sorts of weapons you can use against civilians. One of the problems with cluster munitions is that a lot of bomblets are used. A number of them turn out to be duds and they stay there. So, as with mines, they're seen as a dangerous legacy, that where they're used for years, decades even afterwards, these things may pop up and cause significant harm. So that's always been quite a strong argument against their use. The argument is the more modern weapons have fewer duds. The Ukrainians say, look, it's their territory, they know how they use them. And anyway, cluster munitions have already been used, right. Old Soviet types, but by both sides in this war already.
Just putting it in a broader perspective, in terms of the course of the war, obviously we saw the Russian Mutiny. We've seen some sort of fallout from that, but we don't quite know what. Ukraine's president admits his counteroffensive is slow, but he does say Ukraine is advancing, whereas he says Russia is retreating. What's your analysis of what's happened since that mutiny?
Well, what's been happening was happening before the mutiny as well. So essentially the war's in an attritional stage. It's quite hard for the Ukrainians to move forward very fast. They are moving forward in some areas, but it's sort of a kilometre a day rather than tens of kilometres. And that's because what they're trying to do at the moment is draw Russian forces in so that they can basically engage in a war of attrition, attacking their artillery pieces, their tanks, their forward units, their ammunition dumps, fuel dumps, or whatever. Obviously, the Russians are trying to do something similar to Ukraine. So it's a very attritional phase, and the assumption is that if they can get through this successfully, later on, they'll be able to push much harder through rather depleted Russian lines, and then the sort of breakthrough that one associates with big offensives, with more maneuver and as mobile units press through. So it's a very hard, tough stage at the moment, which is one reason why these munitions are wanted.
And how long do you anticipate that phase going on for? Because I remember we spoke, must have been last September, and you said neither side can sustain the war for years. Do you still stand by that? Or, I mean, are we looking now at several months of this attritional phase? Or what's your best guess?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, you can sustain the war for a long time, but not at this level of intensity. So both sides are struggling in different ways to keep the ammunition flowing, and there are shortages that are in evidence. I think this stage of the campaign, I think we'll have a better idea in a few weeks' time as to how it's going. The Ukrainians don't have an indefinite amount of time because this is, especially if you want to get your forces on the move, you need harder ground, and you don't want to wait until the rains come later in the year. So I think we're looking at the next month or two, and then we'll see where we are. But it's an anxious time, I think, for Ukraine, because a lot is riding on the success of this, and it's an anxious time for Putin because his own offensive failed to make any advance, and as he has proclaimed already that the Russian forces are rebuffing those of Ukraine, it'll be a further embarrassment for him if the Ukrainians really do make some progress.
And just finally, you talk about it being an anxious time. One of those anxieties is about what happens with that Zaporizhia nuclear plant. Ukraine has said it suspects Russia's trying to sabotage it. Do you think that's plausible, given the sort of disarray in the Kremlin and the kind of fallout from that?
I think the concern is that on that has eased a little bit over the last couple of days. I think that some of the technical analysis suggests that the power plant isn't as vulnerable, say, as Chernobyl, which we still think about from April '86. So, personally, I find it a bit alarming to think of a nuclear power plant as being in the middle of a war zone, and so I wouldn't be wholly relaxed about it. But I don't think, again, it's one of these things that doesn't really suit either side. I mean, what again one's got in the back of one's mind is what happened with the dam, which again hasn't worked to anybody's advantage, but was breached nonetheless, and caused an environmental disaster. So just because it seems a bad idea and technically you might hope it's a difficult thing to do, doesn't mean to say it definitely won't happen.
Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, thank you very much for joining us.